It's time for the beer radio you've been looking for. This is the show that dispels myths, tackles the toughest topics, and makes no apologies for geeking out on beer. Hosted by two guys that drink before they think. Jamil and John Palmer. This is Brew Strong.
Hey, howdy. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Brew Strong.
Greetings, Cretans.
I like how you lean into the camera for your greetings.
Got to project from the deck. Yeah. So that's good to be good. Good to be back. Another Brew Strong, another interesting topic, and more discussions about our good friend John Blickman.
Absolutely. I'm preparing a live stream now on Facebook.
Oh,
we'll see how that goes.
Found the button, eh?
I found the button. All right, there we go. I think we are live on Facebook. It looks a little delayed, but or no.
Yeah, maybe Spider Wrangler will be up there.
Hold on. Yeah. I'm still on a preview. Oh, add a title.
I bet Bevo misses us.
I miss Bevo right now. Because she would have done this for us and helped us. And I wouldn't be making a mistake here.
Oh, yeah. The meeting is now streaming live on Facebook.
There you go. It still says setting up on my end, but, you know, done redirecting to Facebook live.
Cool.
Justin said we could do it. So there you are. We are live on Facebook. It's not like the greatest thing in the world, but it's working. Okay. So, hey, howdy, hey, everybody. It's John Palmer and Jamil back in sort of studio. I'm here at Heretic Brewing Company in my office, and John is flying
I'm at home
over the
Great Lakes.
world, over the Great Lakes. He's flying over the Great Lakes.
Yes, from my personal space station above the geosynchronous orbit.
Calling from the space station, the International Space Station, is John Palmer. Well, and you know, we've been doing a lot of this. We've been I'm a bit zoomed out, but or zoomed in. I don't know. I've got a meeting tonight with BAM out of Texas, and we're gonna answer some questions there. And I know you've been doing a number of meetings as well.
Yeah, I did one just last week with Mark and the guys from Central Florida, Gainesville.
Yeah, Mark Tamerkin. Yeah. I haven't seen him in ages. I think I'm going to do one with him as well.
Oh, good.
We really should start recording these things. I don't know if they're recording them and posting them, but a lot of times I feel when I am speaking, I am dropping pearls of wisdom here, and so they should be recorded, and they should, you know, this precious information should not get lost. It should be archived, preserved. I think the Smithsonian should be, batching these up and putting them somewhere.
That makes perfect sense to me. Yes.
Actually, you can submit your podcast to be, stored by the Smithsonian. I think there's, you just like some fee or something, and then they will archive it and add it to their archives.
Well, other than impressing the kids, I don't know what they would do, but
yeah, I don't know that my kids would be impressed. Be like,
that's
right.
Yeah, there's the possible downside we really don't want to explore.
Which is it would be stored forever, and we'd be humiliated forever in our fine.
Knowing me, I'd get that one vital piece of information wrong and preserve it for posterity.
For your posterior, is that what you're going to say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would be an ass forever.
You'll be pull it from your posterior and it would be for posterity forever. Yes, yes. Well, that's pretty much how all these Zoom meetings have gone for me. I'm sure I've said something idiotic in every single one of them. So search them out if you want to see me being an idiot, or just check us out on the Brewing Network. We're gonna try and catch up on these shows too, because we've fallen behind because of pandemic related issues, and it's mainly my fault, I think, and then
mine too.
And, we
definitely mine.
We both had reasons we couldn't make it, but happy to be here today. And we're here because of our good friend John Blickman. Without his support over many years now, this show wouldn't be brought to you. So he's actually paid for the show for over a decade. Sounds strange when you say it out loud, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think he's one of the most brilliant minds in brewery engineering, and has created some amazing things that have made your brew day easier and better. And so I like to think of him as innovating your brew day. And if you appreciate that he's paid for the show for over a decade, so you have all this information for free, I would highly suggest emailing him at feedback@blickmanengineering.com and tell him how much you appreciate it. And while you're at it, browse their website, see if they got something new and cool, because they have an amazing array of equipment from more sturdy basic equipment at the Anvil Brewing, and they've got their higher end stuff with a lot more bells and whistles, and then they've got everything to the
pro
line
size. Too.
Yeah. They're doing a pro size brewing equipment now and bringing every bit of innovation and quality that you trust and know Blickman Engineering for. So check it out. Today, we're going to talk about stuck fermentations.
Yes.
That's something that I think every homebrewer experiences, or maybe they did in the past, because I get emails from people and they're like, yeah, I spent a year listening to shows and studying, and now I brewed my first batch and I got best of show at some 500 beer competition. I'm like, wow, where was all this when I started?
Yeah, really.
I had some really crappy brews to pull through. But a good friend, Matt Monson out in Virginia, he wrote back on December 5th, 2012, I am really on the emails, and I swear that the only reason that this is so far behind is because I put it in a special folder for great show ideas, and then I promptly lost the special folder or forgot it even existed. And I came across it the other day, and I'm like, oh, wow, those are really good questions. Thank you, Matt. So Matt wrote, on homebrew forums, I constantly see people asking if their big barley wine fermentation is stuck, what they should do. Invariably, someone will tell the brewer to add enzymes to the fermenter. I immediately scoff at the idea for the reasons that I bet you're thinking of right now. How do you stop the conversion, etc.? But it also leads me to this concept that I'm calling beer ethics. Let's say I use a massive amount of extra amylase enzymes in a mash and convert every single starch into a fermentable sugar. Can this truly be called beer? What will be left over? Does the final gravity of a beer actually indicate something about sugar starch content, or does it also include something about proteins, glucans, or other? I'm sure something like this would taste like beer, wet, hoppy, grainy, alcoholic, carbonated. But will it be like beer's bizarro twin? Just another avenue to explore in this relationship between attenuation, sweetness, alcohol, and final gravity. Thanks, Matt. Yeah. I think maybe once or twice homebrewing did I add enzymes to a fermentation. Generally, if I used any extra enzymes, amylase enzymes, it was in the kettle, not even in the mash. I've added it in the mash, but generally in the kettle. And we've used it a couple of times here at Heretic when we're kind of experimenting on possibilities. We don't use it in our regular line of beers and general production.
Do you do brewed IPAs much and use it there?
We've done one here, and I've done a couple with friends, for collaborations and such.
Right.
And really, the amylase enzymes. A number of us aren't really sure that that's necessary to make a good brewed IPA, because we're already able to attenuate further, and you can add glucose. Essentially, dextrose is glucose. You can add that, ferment it out, versus adding the amylase enzyme and trying to convert more of the maltose into glucose. And I think, I don't know. I think, it's not that necessary maybe to use amylase enzymes on smaller beers that you're trying to get dry.
Right.
So, John, what is a stuck fermentation?
Well, the stuck fermentation is when your yeast reach the end of their nutrients and cease reproduction. And the high growth phase, that is when they do the majority of their attenuation. They're taking in sugars, producing energy, reproducing new yeast cells. And if they run out of nutrients, we talk about sterols that they need oxygen at the beginning of fermentation to generate sterols to replenish their cell membranes and so on and so on. Well, at the beginning of fermentation, they take in these nutrients and they store them in the vacuole, and they share that vacuole with the daughter cell. And so as they reproduce, they will get down to a point where they can no longer divide. And then their, life for them as they know it ends. They go into stationary phase where they stop fermenting and wait for the next batch of wort to come along so they can replenish themselves and start all over again. So a stuck fermentation is where the yeast stop fermenting, stop consuming sugars, and going into the stationary phase.
Right. So stuck fermentation can happen in any fermentation whatsoever. It can happen in a small beer. It's more likely that it ends in it's a stuck fermentation in a higher beer. Stuck meaning you anticipated more attenuation than you got,
right?
And the beer seems to be slowing down, not really fermenting. It's kind of chugging along, and most people experience that in bigger beers, and it's caused by either a lack of healthy yeast or the environment for healthy yeast to ferment fully.
Right.
So,
it gets too cold, for example.
Too cold, lots of unfermentable dextrins, and that's why the attenuation is less than you're expecting. But generally, it is in the higher gravity beers, and it's caused usually by a lack of, if you've pitched enough yeast, it's caused by a lack of three main nutrients, which is oxygen, zinc, and on something where you're adding a lot of adjunct, if you're adding a lot of simple sugars, free amino nitrogen is critical.
Right.
So in an all malt beer, generally you have enough free amino nitrogen, depending on, growth conditions, where you got the malt. But, most maltsters, they're paying attention to this, and, any good, malt will have plenty of free amino nitrogen. But if you're adding a lot of dextrose or something like that, you might need to supplement. We did a beer recently called Amnesia Juice that we dosed with dextrose multiple times at certain points with, and we had a special blend of nutrients and free amino nitrogen in with the dextrose that we dosed it with, and we pushed California ale yeast to go to 16.5%. So
wow.
It's all possible. It just, you need to provide the ideal environment for the yeast for them to ferment fully. Let's see. Excuse me. I'm a little
Should grab a beer.
phlegmy today. Yes, I need a beer. Where's my beer? Doing this early in the morning. I can't be drinking now. And this is early in the morning because I'm a beer guy. You know.
Right.
So what can we do to fix a stuck fermentation? The idea of enzymes. Well, the only thing the enzyme doing, if you add amylase enzyme, or people have talked about adding Beano to your fermentation.
Right.
If it's stuck, you're already stuck. Converting the sugars in there to
simpler
glucose,
sugars,
simpler sugars, breaking down some of those things, longer chain polysaccharides into simple sugars, isn't going to necessarily create fermentation or get fermentation going again. Fermentation is stopped once. It depends how stopped the yeast are, because in a high alcohol environment, when the yeast have already decided there's nothing more to do, they flocculate, they shut down. It's really difficult to get them started again in a high alcohol environment, or environment that will get them out of the flocculation mode and into individual cells that can ferment. So the enzymes are just breaking down those starches. So they're creating simpler sugars. It's useful. It can be useful before fermentation, but once the yeast have stopped, it's high ABV. Forget it. Matt was asking, is it ethical? Well, for me, I think of course. The malted grains that you're using in your mash, they are containing the same or similar enzymes to what you find if you're adding amylase. There's amylase in the malt, and so you're already using enzymes. It's just another tool. It's like using a pitch of yeast. You're using a concentrated yeast slurry that somebody has made for you versus exposing your wort to the air and hoping for it to fall into it. So it's just another tool. It's perfectly ethical. I know there's a number of breweries where they improve their efficiency by adding enzymes to their mash to increase the extract and the yield that they get. It isn't for most of us, smaller guys, but there are people who definitely do it. Let's see. And you can compare that to adding dextrose or other simple sugars. Adding dextrose, I mean, you're adding glucose to your wort to ferment and ferment higher. And is that more ethical than adding enzymes and converting to glucose? I don't know. I think either's fine. Like I said, just a tool. Yes, people have called me a tool before, so apparently a beer tool as well. And is it beer? His question is can you call it beer? Well, the interesting thing is, I think it was 2006 or something like that. The TTB, in a letter of understanding, I think with the FDA, I don't know, that the definition of beer kind of changed, the legal definition of beer. And beer, a malt beverage is anything that uses malt and at least, I think, 7 pounds per 100 barrels of beer of hops. Sounds like a Budweiser kind of thing, 7 pounds per 100 barrels. That is called a malt beverage. Anything without the hops and malt, or not using both of those, is called beer. So if you make a hard seltzer, let's say out of corn or rice, and there's no hops, that's called beer. And
it seems backwards.
Exactly. It seems backwards. And people go, no, that's not the way it is. Because if in the past, and I've talked about this on the air, if you went and got yourself a wine cooler, it said malt beverage on it.
Yeah.
Now they say beer, because it's been reversed. So if you get a can, I think a White Claw, it says beer.
Huh. I bet the TTB made a typo and just ran with it.
Just they didn't want to admit their mistake. Yeah, so it was kind of like, well, people were, I guess, complaining that malt beverage, but the reason why they went to using malt in all these, wine coolers and things like that was it was cheaper. If you use wine or use spirits, it's very expensive. If, for example, in California, we're looking at making our own canned cocktails. We're going to release it in about a month, and in California, it's about $7.50 of tax on one case of 12-ounce cans, just because we're using spirits for it. If we used beer or malt, it would go down to 40 cents, something like that. 40 cents on a case versus $7.50 on a case.
Wow,
The
that's a big
alcohol
difference.
level would be the same. It's based on below 50% alcohol and above 50% alcohol. Below 50%, it's all the same. So it's very expensive. So that's why all these things went to using malt, and then they all started calling themselves malt beverages. That changed, and now they should be labeled as beer. I mean, there might be exceptions. People haven't quite caught up since 2006 or whatever it was. But beer is anything else. Malt beverage has to have malt and 7 pounds of hops per 100 barrel minimum to be called malt beverage. Fascinating, isn't it? Yet I can also label my products with ale, lager, beer, stout, porter. I think lager. It has to have one of those designations on it. So I can call it beer, but it's technically a malt beverage, and it's not a beer. Fascinating, isn't it?
Strange.
The world of government and
no kidding.
licensing and all that.
Wow.
All right. So yes, it would be called a malt beverage technically, but it is still a beer. I thought he had an interesting question. What is left behind?
Oh,
and
yeah.
We did a show recently, or maybe it'll be in the future. I don't know. Where we talked about what is produced during fermentation. And let's see here. Normally, you would add your enzymes to the mash or to the wort, and then you halt it by boiling at a certain point. So you're not overdriving things and really thinning out the beer. And it takes a good amount of time. If you're doing a brewed IPA like you were talking about, we add it to the kettle, and you got to wait. Even at optimum temperature, it just takes quite a while. You gotta keep stirring it, and it takes a while to get full activity. And I guess depending on the enzymes, correct me if I'm wrong here, John, but theoretically you can get everything, all the polysaccharides down to just glucose if you have the mixture of enzymes, right?
Right.
There's certain, starches or polysaccharides that the amylase enzyme won't act on until they're broken down. I mean, that's why there's beta amylase and alpha amylase. And once the beta cleaves, then the alpha amylase can go to town. And So, but with a combination of enzymes, I imagine you can just make a big puddle of glucose. Here.
Yeah. You could reduce all the starches down to sugars, to simple sugars that would ferment.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of other, well, not a lot, but there is some other content in the wort as well.
The proteins.
The proteins.
Yeah.
You have polysaccharides that are not hexoses; they're pentoses, and those are not fermentable.
Mm-hmm.
So those and the bonds on those sugars would be different than the hexose sugars. So I think like the amyloglucosidase wouldn't act on those.
Right.
But
if you had the right combination of enzymes in the right sequence,
your beta glucanases and all the other ones, you could reduce it all to simple sugars.
Right. But most of the flavor remains. The flavor of the mash is not in the sugars. I mean, other than sweetness, which gets fermented out,
Right.
the flavor is other compounds.
Yeah. Your Maillard reaction compounds and so on. Yep.
Exactly. And when you're talking about these enzymes, you're mainly breaking down maltose into simpler sugars that the yeast can more readily take up. Yeast will consume glucose very quickly. It's a very simple process for them. What the yeast do normally is they break down these sugars into glucose themselves and then utilize the
Right.
glucose. So they're doing that process. If you do it for them, it's much easier for them. It's like cutting up a steak. For your child, it's much easier for your child to consume that steak than if they need to figure out how to use a knife and fork. And when they're young, that can take a while. For them to chop up a steak. Let's see. If you did this, your final gravity would drop below zero. If you fermented it out, you could get your final gravity quite down, and it would probably seem fairly thin as well. If you add enough enzymes and break everything down, it would come pretty thin. But again, your flavors coming from your alcohol, your fermentation from your hops. There's these yeast flavor active compounds. So, at the end of fermentation, you've got some of these long chain sugars left over.
Right.
They're going to add more of a fullness. Not a whole lot of sweetness, not a lot of flavor either. Maltose really doesn't taste like much at all. Pure maltose, it's just a sugar that's maybe 2/3 as sweet as table sugar. You're going to have proteins left over. They're your linear chains of amino acids. You're going to have alcohols, and you're going to have, most importantly, your yeast derived flavor active compounds. So those ethanol, CO2, carbonyls, your aldehydes, ketones, higher and fusel alcohols, I like to say, esters, VDKs, diacetyl and others, fatty and organic acids, and then sulfur compounds. And that's the main part of what's left over. If you were to ferment out, if you were to break everything down with enzymes and you'd still have all that flavor. So the flavor isn't coming from those being long chains. That's more of a body thing. So the other common thing that people will say when you have a stuck fermentation is, hey, how about adding champagne yeast to the beer?
They figure that the fermentation is stuck because the yeast can't go any higher in the alcohol content. They've reached their limit.
Right, which can be true. The problem is, if the environment isn't proper for the yeast to get started, they will pretty much do nothing. I've experimented, back when I started, and more recently I've given this a try to see if it works. And you can, even if you get a yeast active in, say, a starter, and then you add it active to a beer that is high in alcohol and doesn't have a lot of the appropriate sugars, it'll often fail. You can have some success. The high alcohol, I think I was told early on that, once it reaches like 8%, 7-8%, you can't really get fermentation started with a new yeast again. But I think that's wrong. I think you can. It's when you get into the 11, 12, 13s that is really difficult to get it started again out of the yeast. But if you were to, convert, let's say for some reason, usually these things are stuck because the maltose wasn't consumed. That's what is the residual sugar and why you have this high gravity that's not finishing out. It's not that it's, these super high chain sugars, and adding an enzyme is going to break that maltose down into glucose, and perhaps pitching a fresh active slurry of champagne yeast or something like that might do it. But you generally don't need those yeasts unless you're talking an ABV over, let's say, if you're trying to push it, to 15 and above.
Right.
And if you are looking, and most yeast can be pushed to 15%. But if you're going to be pushing for that percentage, you should have pitched that yeast earlier. And I've always said champagne yeast, I mean, if there's a lot of glucose left, yes. But if you're trying to ferment maltose, there are better yeasts for fermenting maltose than champagne yeast, I think. For example, White Labs has their WLP 099 super high gravity ale yeast. That's better suited to a maltose fermentation. And that, goes as high or higher than any champagne yeast will. So, you might try that. But none of these yeasts work well without the appropriate environment. So
right.
I used the analogy before of shooting a bow and arrow and trying to hit a target. You're trying to hit this target gravity, but your setup of the bow, your pull of the bow, your angle of the bow, the arrow that you're shooting, all this stuff is dependent. That's your setup. That's your your mash profile. That's your nutrients, your zinc, your oxygen, other micronutrients, your pitching rate, your yeast strain selection. All this adds up to your setup for this shot, and whether you're going to hit the target or not, or whether you're going to be wide of the target. And if you have a good setup, fermentation will go, and you will hit your targets. So once you loose that arrow, once you pitch that yeast, you're off and you're going, and you have far less control at that point than you did before. Your control is in setting up the proper fermentation, not in trying to goose the fermentation along once it's started.
Right.
That becomes difficult. You have temperature you can control. You can do an extra dose of oxygen, things like that. But really, that becomes tricky.
Yeah, you've brewed high gravity beers many times over the years, and your triple IPA is an excellent example where
Evil 3.
The Evil 3. I thought that was a 7% beer. You said no, it's a 13. And it's like, wow, so smooth. But you attacked that beer by getting the setup right. In terms of your pitching rate, your aeration, controlling the mash and controlling the sugars and the nutrients that the yeast needed for a good fermentation. And it went right through, didn't get stuck. So often I think stuck fermentations are a result of, as you were saying, of poor preparation, not pitching enough yeast, not providing the right conditions for the yeast when they were pitched in terms of aeration or temperature and what have you.
Absolutely. And, I can't stress enough that's the way, to make a great, high gravity or high alcohol fermentation. Jimmy Gurr was asking, what percentage does it become malt liquor? It depends on the state in the U.S., I guess. Because a lot of those names are used specifically for state related issues. I know in Texas they had a whole thing about I don't know if they still do, but you had to call something a Bock or a Bale or a Lager depending on the ABV.
Yeah, if it was above 6 or something. Yeah.
Yeah, they still have like 2 different licenses for Travis was telling me something about beers above 5%. You need 1 license, and beers below 5% you need another license. And so people end up having to get 2 licenses if they want to brew something below 5%. So it forces people to brew everything above 5%. I thought that was pretty fascinating. So, yeah, a lot of these laws have unintended consequences as to what the beer will be.
Well, I think, going back, how do we fix a stuck fermentation? I think is the key question.
Right.
And you've touched on it, but
right. I think pitching more yeast often isn't the answer once fermentation is done. Really, you can do a couple of things. You can add some additional nutrients and hope that the yeast are still active enough. If you see your fermentation slowing down, you can add another dose of oxygen.
right.
You can add you can resuspend the yeast, swirl your carboy or your bucket or whatever, or pump it around and get the yeast mixed up in the beer. Add temperature, add warmth. Warmth will speed things up. It allows gets the yeast more active. And you can add something like superfood, or superfood is 30% diammonium phosphate DAP, and a blend of vitamins. Or FermFed is another favorite one. That's diammonium phosphate, thiamine, amino acids, sterols, some proteins, some microelements, vitamins, and organic and inorganic DAP. And then they also have a DAP-free version of FermFed, which you want the DAP. The diammonium phosphate, essentially takes the place of FAN. And if you're making a high adjunct beer, if you're adding more than, if you're trying to, it's such a complex topic to talk about.
Yeah.
If you're trying to brew something, let's say, that is high ABV, and it's got like 10% adjunct. For example, on Evil 3, we use like maybe 8% dextrose, not a whole lot. So it's just a normal fermentation, and it attenuates well. If I was trying to do the same beer with 30% dextrose or 40% dextrose, I would want to add some more free amino nitrogen for the yeast, because otherwise it's probably going to crap out at some point and leave a sweeter finish than I want. And I see a lot of people with that problem when they're trying to make these bigger beers. So I would, look at adding the free amino nitrogen, all that, because the yeast will just ferment the glucose, and then they'll shut down and not really ferment much of the maltose. And that's what happens. So the glucose will go first. So you can do that. If you're adding diammonium phosphate, DAP, or a nutrient that has it, you have to be careful, because if you add too much, especially early on, your fermentation will go like a rocket, and you will get solventy hot. You'll get a lot of fusel alcohols. You got to be very careful about that.
Right.
But in fixing a stuck fermentation, I think your best bet is not necessarily enzymes, because it's going to produce more glucose. That's true. If you didn't get your balance of enzymes correct to start with, or balance of sugars correct to start with, if you're trying to ferment a 20% all malt beer, you're going to struggle. There's only so much maltose that they'll ferment. But if you're stuck, you could add oxygen again, resuspend the yeast, warmth, and a nutrient rich the FermFed, I think is good stuff. And that will, if your yeast is still in suspension active, some of them, they'll pick that up and they'll go. That will give them the strength. The reason that you're adding some of these things is that, and oxygen, is that gives them a boost to their sterols and their lipid layer, and helps them stave off the higher alcohol, which is poison to them. So that's the reason why you do it. Scott was asking, can you add O2 latent fermentation without oxidation? Yeah, absolutely. This is another one of those things that when I started homebrewing, I'm sure, John, it was the same thing for you. It's like, well, once you've added your yeast, you don't add any oxygen. You never add oxygen. You want to avoid oxidation because you're going to end up with a stale beer. And really, I think that's more true when you're talking about, after fermentation is done and when you're talking about packaging,
Right.
when there's very little yeast left. When there's yeast and they're active and you hit them with more oxygen, they will keep going. They'll take that oxygen up in a heartbeat, and you really won't have an issue with any oxidation in the beer.
Yep. I got to get rid of the cat here. Sorry.
Is that a euphemism for something? You got to toss the cat?
Yes.
You done tossing the cat?
Throw it out the window. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I have just comments on what you were saying. Yeah. It's stuck fermentations are usually more about getting the yeast to restart rather than breaking down more sugar for them to eat. It's so enzymes is one possible cure, but that's a small percentage of stuck fermentations, I think. Usually it's a matter of reinvigorating the yeast, and as you say, that is a question of perhaps adding amino acids or oxygen or other nutrients that they need to restart their growth phase and start attenuating and taking in sugars.
Well, and one of the things, one of the things I think we should do a show on is how to set up to brew, a beer above 15%, 15 to 20% beer or over 20% beer. And, one of the keys is either limiting the amount of maltose that's present by, using an enzyme and driving, more into like a simple sugar like glucose, or first ferment the maltose. And this is I'm more of a fan of this, is make a beer that would be 8 or 10% and ferment the maltose. You get the yeast to go through all those, and as they're running out of maltose, then you start introducing the simple sugars, the dextrose. We do I actually made a dextrose calculator, lactose calculator and a dextrose calculator, and I can tell you exactly how much dextrose can be dissolved at what temperature and what volume it'll take and how much water.
Oh, nice.
And how that will affect the temperature of whatever you're adding it to, and where it'll stay liquid and where it goes hard on you. So we'll make a slurry of concentrated slurry of dextrose, and firm fed, and zinc is really important to your fermentations as well. But and then we'll ferment out the maltose first, and then do small doses of the solution periodically as the yeast is going, and timing it correctly. And you can add oxygen too, but timing it correctly and adding the oxygen and adding the slurry, you can really push a yeast to its maximum. Did I mention it earlier? I think I mentioned on the last show about we got O1 to go to 16.5%.
Yeah.
Which generally they say, but all these are kind of guidelines, just like temperature and everything else is kind of a guideline on how you what you can expect. And it's like, again, shooting the arrow, you can expect, if you set it up properly, this kind of arrow, this kind of bow, you should be able to go this distance and kind of hit this target. And that's essentially what it's doing. And then I would just shoot myself in the foot with the arrow. So just there you go.
Yep.
What else about stuck fermentations? What was your first stuck fermentation, John?
I forget. I mean, it must have been 20 years ago or more. But I've had more often, the diastaticus type of fermentation problems than stuck. But yeah, it's usually it was a matter of underpitching,
Mm-hmm.
and so just 2 packets of dry yeast instead of 1 packet made a world of difference for those 7% beers that would be like on the borderline for 1 packet of yeast to handle. Doing 2, and they would ferment out fine.
Right.
You mentioned zinc. Zinc is, I think we should elaborate on that a little bit. Zinc is crucial for fermentation in that it is an essential cofactor for one of the enzymes that breaks acetaldehyde down into alcohol,
Mm-hmm.
into the ethanol. And usually yeasts have enough zinc, especially if you've bought the yeast from a commercial source. But when you start repitching yeast, fermentation to fermentation, like you do at Heretic, you can run into zinc deficiencies where,
Right.
and without the yeast cell having sufficient zinc, they can't break down the acetaldehyde. So that's where the zinc additions to a stuck fermentation may help fix it.
Yeah. Well, and it has a lot to do with the reproduction of yeast as well, and one of the things that we found was that most of the nutrients being sold didn't have sufficient zinc.
Okay.
We did some measurement of our wort. Actually, we took it to our friends at the local Anheuser-Busch plant,
Oh,
only about 10 miles from here. Brewers help brewers, and they're
yeah.
brewers.
Yeah.
They're good brewers. They test our wort for us, and the nutrient, even with the nutrient addition, the zinc was insufficient. So what we do now is we add zinc monohydrate to our wort. It takes very little. You can overdo it with the zinc, but what I found is that when people say, "Oh, I've got a sluggish fermentation, I've got a problem with the beer's finishing," they go. Fermentation should go fairly quick. I mean, you shouldn't be weeks into a fermentation with it bubbling, once a minute.
Right.
And I hear lots of stories of that. And usually the issue is not enough zinc. It really does help, with fermentation. And, a second dose of oxygen. I like to do it once they have done their growth phase, and then give them a hit of oxygen to help replenish the sterols and the lipid layer. So usually I'll go 8 to 18 hours in. I'll hit them with extra oxygen.
Okay.
And they're always saying, well, that's safe, but they say, oh, don't add oxygen after that. You can add oxygen after that. It does change things. It'll make the yeast kind of lag for a bit as they take up the oxygen, but they love oxygen, and they'll take it up, and then they'll get going again. So you can definitely add more oxygen.
Yeah, well, think about open fermentation for that matter. I mean, their oxygen's available to them the whole time, and it doesn't hurt the beer. It doesn't oxidize the beer. Where oxygen is a real detriment is after fermentation.
Yeah, and packaging. And I think, again, back in the old homebrew days, there wasn't as much, attention to the packaging, and
Right.
people relied on, bottle conditioning and stuff like that. And, there was some issues, and maybe that's it. There are some effects of adding oxygen during fermentation. Don't get me wrong, that can produce certain compounds that maybe you don't want, but, used in balance, and especially in these high gravity beers and high alcohol beers, it's a useful tool. Ronald was asking, what about the use of magnesium in high gravity beers? Is that the same effect as zinc, John?
No, I wouldn't think so. I mean, the malt supplies a lot of magnesium, and the numbers I've read, they require about 4 ppm in terms for fermentation. And the malt will supply about 70 ppm. So there's should be sufficient magnesium in typical wort, even if it's a high adjunct wort.
It is used by the yeast in a similar way.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
I don't know the exact. Yeah.
California, you gotta have sensors on every light. If you don't move enough, I get so intent on the show. Neil was asking, here's a question, Jamil. If you happen to pitch at too low a temperature for the given yeast strain, is just raising the fermentation temp enough to get it going? Not really a stuck fermentation, more of a non-starter. Assumes wort has proper nutrients and O2. I know I've had this happen, and it didn't recover, so I added additional yeast after the higher temperature became stable. Yeah, I actually, Neil, I've had that issue too back back in the day, and actually I think we had an issue similar to that here at Heretic, where one of our glycol actuated valves, remained
stuck open. Yeah.
God knows what reason. I think it was a failed RTD connection that caused it to happen, and so the tank got down in the 50s just right after pitching, and so it wasn't fermenting. And what we ended up doing was stirring the fermenter, pumping everything around, and bubbling more oxygen through. And once we get the temp up, it's very difficult to get the temperature up on 100 barrels of beer, with no heating elements present. I've had more success in small tanks. We actually have a little 5-barrel experimental tank, yeast propagator in it, and I put heating in line on there, and so you can heat in that one. And by doing so, generally, then fermentation will often kick off if you're in an environment, a nutrient and sugar-rich environment for the yeast, and you pitched it and it was cold and they just didn't really get started. By warming up, and they really should start back up again if they were truly healthy and the environment's right. Just because they will. It may not be as active a fermentation, but what I've seen is that you will get it to ferment. It will get going again, and it is possible to take it up. Pitching additional yeast once it becomes temp stable, that's also a viable option, especially if there's no alcohol already produced by the yeast. It should just be like starting again or starting up originally. If all the other yeast has fallen out and you have the ability to rack off of that, either bottom dump if you're commercial, or if you're homebrewer and you don't have that, you could rack the wort to a second vessel. Reoxygenate, pitch a fresh, make sure it's warm enough, pitch a yeast and do that. And you definitely should be able to get it going then. I think, it's a good question, Neil. It's kind of the opposite thing that we were thinking of. Any other advice on high fermentation, stuck gravity, stuck ferments?
No, I think those are the main points. And setup is key, and then and kind of resetting up or restarting, the fermentation by taking it back to the proper environment, proper conditions for the pitch is probably the best way to get it restarted.
Yep. Well, there you go. John Palmer himself. All right, everybody. Thank you for listening in and or watching and seeing our not beautiful faces, but seeing our faces and spending some time with us. We're gonna try and set this up for Tuesdays around this time.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, we got a lot to catch up on. We know we're behind on shows. We apologize. This all pandemic thing has kind of messed us up. Oh, Craig wants to know, where do you get zinc? We bought it by the industrial 100 kilo sacks, and so they use it in like cattle.
Mhm.
They feed it to cattle to improve the cattle health. So that's one place to get it. I think you can get zinc supplement tablets or something like that, and that tends to be zinc heptahydrate. So you have to use a bit more because it's got more water in it. But
Right.
I think we do a show on zinc additions. If we didn't, we should. I have tons of information, lots of data.
We should plan a zinc show for next week.
I can't have it ready for next week.
Okay.
What do you think I am?
A genius, yes.
Thank you. So thanks again for listening. Make sure to reach out to our fine sponsor, Blickman Engineering. You can email John at feedback@blickmanengineering.com. Tell him how much you appreciate him sponsoring the show. Tell him how much you appreciate his genius in making brewing equipment. And, if you got time, just check out the cool stuff on the website. You don't have to buy anything.
Right.
I'm just saying, just spread the good word about how kind they've been over the last decade plus in paying for this show, so you don't have to. All right.
Very good.
Until then, everybody, brew strong.
Brew strong, everyone.